Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Tiger King. Let's talk about it. So Tiger King is a Netflix documentary series that has taken the world by storm. When I first saw this series on Netflix, I didn't think anything of it. It definitely wasn't something that was priority viewing for me because it's been a rough few weeks, it's been a rough few months, it's been a rough 2020. And even the idea of watching a series about the abuse of animals, the abuse of big cats was just it was daunting to me, if I'm being completely honest. I was like, can my heart even take any more heaviness this year? But I did eventually cave to all of the drama and all of the hype, and I have to say, this series made for some interesting viewing. So we're going to go through the entirety of this documentary, and there will be spoilers throughout, but this is going to be a rundown on my thoughts on this crazy Netflix documentary series. But before we get to my thoughts on it, please be sure to subscribe to my channel to catch new videos that I'll be posting. I'm especially excited because this weekend we have Killing Eve season 3, one of my favorite shows ever. I am so excited. I will definitely be posting a review for that series, so please be sure to subscribe so you can catch that review. But without further ado, let's get into Tiger King. So usually when I'm doing these reviews, I have a script and I go through the positives and negatives of whatever it is that I'm reviewing. But in this case, my mind was just blown. So we're just gonna freeball it, just like the Tiger King himself. So first off, we have the Tiger King himself, Joe Exotic, who is the main character that we're following throughout this crazy series. Now, he is a collector of wild animals, much like the other people in this series. It's this whole community of people who collect wild animals and also sell them off and also breed them. It's absolutely insane, but it definitely exists in America and throughout the world, I'm sure. And the legality of this entire situation is extremely blurry and extremely obscure. And the community itself is filled with very interesting, controversial and dangerous characters. So it's a very different group of people that we're following throughout this documentary series. They're almost the type of people that you would see on the other side of a documentary, where you're following the good guys and they would be the antagonists in the documentary, but instead we're following their story, which is, I think, what makes this series so different and so crazy to follow, on top of the fact that their personalities are crazy. And speaking of crazy personalities, going back to Joey Exotic himself, the reason why he's such an interesting focal point for this documentary series is because he seems to be in the middle of this community, and he's a very public figure as well. He's someone who, he worked social media before social media was a thing. He was definitely involved in creating a public image for himself for decades, and as a result, he's kind of known in his community and in the wider community in America as well. And throughout this series, we learn a lot about his operations on the zoo and how he hires his staff because they're very poor and downtrodden, and a lot of them have criminal backgrounds, so they have nowhere else to go, and they potentially resort to eating the meat off of the trucks that are supposed to be feeding the tigers themselves. It's a very rough situation in this zoo, and it's nowhere near as glamorous as he portrays it as, and that is the case for a lot of the other zoos as well that we see in this documentary. There's also this horrific incident where one of his employees' arms gets torn off her body by a tiger. It is... Oh, and then she goes back to work like a week later, like nothing happened, just so that the zoo wouldn't get bad press. It's just, this is why I didn't want to watch this during quarantine time. My heart is already heavy, and that just made it sink to the ground. So yeah, Joey Exotic is definitely leading a double life in terms of how he portrays himself to his fans and to his online community versus what's actually going on behind the scenes with the tigers, with the other animals, with his staff, with his husbands, plural. What are the marital laws in America? I didn't realize you could have more than one husband slash wife. Like, I didn't realize that this was a thing. Anyways, so we're definitely dealing with a very complex character to follow along this journey. And because he's not the protagonist whatsoever, like, he's definitely the bad guy, we don't really want to be rooting for him ultimately, even if he does have moments of levity and also moments of actual emotion. At the end of the day, make no mistake, the only protagonists in this series are the animals. That's it. Every single human here is trash, pretty much. So that can definitely be a bit difficult and arduous when you're following them along their journey, knowing that they are in the wrong and that ultimately the villains of this story. And going back to what I said about how Joey is this really interesting entry point into this bizarre community. And one of the main focal points of the series is the rivalry between Joey and Carol. Now, Carol is a woman who definitely presents herself as the hero of the day. She is an animal rights activist, although again that is a very disputed status, because when you dive in deep into her history, it's far more complex than you could have ever even imagined. But she has this very vicious rivalry with Joey and with all of the other zoo owners that are like him, where they're kind of exhibitioning these animals and treating them poorly in her eyes. And she has her own reserve that has, you know, all of these wild animals as well as a ton of tigers, which is like the main focus of this series. And she presents herself as this hero animal rescuer who is trying to prevent the crimes being committed to these wild animals from happening and all of the animal abuse from happening by actually getting laws passed so that this practice could be made illegal and the ownership of wild animals, including tigers, would be made illegal as well, which I think is a very valid point, and I think it makes her a very interesting protagonist to latch onto in this series, except it's very quickly revealed that she's nowhere near as heroic as she thinks she is, and in fact in a lot of ways she's just a big old hypocrite. She also hosts tons and tons of people coming to her reserve to see these animals, and she does this under the guise of being, again, this animal rescuer, this animal rights activist. But actually, when you look at it on a basic level, they're essentially doing the same thing. They're profiting in the very same way, and that's already a mess to untangle. But then this series goes one step further and reveals that Carol's husband actually disappeared several decades ago, and many people suspect her of murdering him. This is, I mean, for an entire episode, we take a break from the tigers and everything else that's going on to focus in on this murder mystery that is baffling in itself and deserves its own series. And we find out that this character, who again is presenting herself as the hero of the day, is potentially a murderer. I don't know. The evidence stacked against her is just so, like, it's baffling how was she brought in for questioning? She's a pretty big suspect in this case, even though the sheriff kept saying that there are no suspects, but like, are you blind? There's a lot going on here to suggest otherwise. Now, of course, this is a documentary series, so we don't know if certain things were edited in certain ways to present certain characters as being potential murderers. I'm just saying that from what we see on screen, it looks like there is a very clear suspect. And also, side note, if I could just cheekily add this in, I find it curious how Carol was definitely in a very tense relationship with her her second husband, I believe he was. Her second husband. So she found herself a third husband who is much more, I guess, pliable, like someone who clearly worships the ground that she walks on. I don't know. And again, this is the editing and the way that things are presented, but it seems to me like the old husband's replacement is certainly more agreeable to whatever she wants to do. So either way, she ended up happier and winning after the unfortunate passing or disappearance of the previous husband. And speaking of marriages, there's a lot of that going around in this series as well, because as I mentioned, Joe Exotic has 2 husbands, actually 3 husbands in the entirety of this series. But then you also have this very interesting character called Doc something, who is another zoo owner and, you know, wild animal breeder and all of that. He does all of that stuff, and he's another legend in this community as well. And there's also this suggestion in the series that perhaps he may be the leader of a cult. There's this group of young women who work for him in his zoo, and apparently they're taken in at a very young age, like in their teenage years or in their late teenage years, and they're taken on as apprentices, and they basically work, I think, for free or for very little money a week, and they work a lot. Essentially their whole lives revolved around the zoo and revolved around him, and on top of this they're all kind of his wives. There's definitely something fishy going on over there. Clearly there's a lot of manipulation, a lot of brainwashing that's happening, and these poor women are basically trapped in this scenario, perhaps not physically trapped, like they can leave, but then as it's pointed out in the show, I believe they always say that when it comes to cults, that you can leave. But the problem is that you become indoctrinated, that you feel like you have to stay, you feel like your entire life belongs to that cult or to that cult leader. And there's a lot of brainwashing that's explored on this show. Beyond the cult itself, there's also this idea that these tigers, these baby cubs, are being used as a kind of bait to lure women in. They're living a life. They're living a whole different lifestyle that is fascinating and horrific at the same time. And the first part of this series is definitely about exploring these lifestyles and about getting us to understand exactly the community that we're dealing with, so that later on when we get into this huge investigation, we understand the characters at play. And again, usually when we're dealing with this type of story, we would have seen some sort of protagonist to latch onto, to root for throughout this process, so that we would have felt sympathy for them or empathy for them when they're going through the investigation process. But instead, everyone's a bad guy. Everyone deserves to be behind bars. So by the end, you're just wondering who's actually going to get caught, if not everyone. Now, in terms of the investigation itself, I did feel like that was just a bombardment of so much information and so much going on at once. It definitely felt like we were flitting back and forth between all of these different players all of a sudden, and everything was happening at once and things were just moving so quickly. But at the same time, ultimately what happened was pretty disappointing, because everyone got away with everything that they were doing, especially when it came to the plan to assassinate Carol. That to me was bonkers. How is everyone who was involved in that not in jail? How? The deals that the FBI were making, I don't even know. That to me showed the stakes of the rivalry here, because for a moment there it seemed like they were just playing kiddie games and just bickering at each other about, you know, their principles, and really not about their principles, but mostly their profit margins. But then it turned into this whole action movie subplot where you have an assassin that's about to go get her, and they're planning the routes and Google mapping the situation. That was just completely different, and I think everyone involved should have been locked up. That's scary. They're still out there. That guy was chilling in a bathtub. The guy that was supposed to kill Carol, he's just chilling there. How does the law work here? So overall, I can definitely see how this documentary series captured the imagination and the fascination of the entire world, especially during quarantine season right now. I do think just in terms of being a documentary, it's a very interesting and a very good documentary, because it takes a look at not just this one character, but how he fits into the overall jigsaw puzzle. And also with this incredibly interesting story diving into this weird but fascinating community, the jigsaw pieces themselves seem to fit really, really well, because they're all connected within this community and they all know each other and they all know each other's pasts. And that also adds to the fact that there are no real heroes or victims to this story, apart from that poor employee who lost her arm, and of course the animals themselves, which the show does a very good job of pointing out at the very end of this series. I will say though, if there was any criticism that I'd have, it would be that the show doesn't really focus on how the animals got there. Like, how did these animals get to America in the first place? Because we know that tigers aren't naturally found in America, although now there are more tigers in America than there are in India. But I would have liked to see a little bit more of background information on how these tigers got to the US in the first place, because you only see them coming out of these white vans. And I know that these zoo owners sell between them, so that's another method that they would get to these wild animals and these tigers. But at the same time, you know what's really happening is that a lot of these animals are being hunted and kidnapped, taken away from their countries of origin to countries where owning a wild animal like a tiger is legal. So with all of that said, I'm going to be giving Tiger King a 7.5 out of 10. I feel like 7.5 is valid because we definitely explore the character of the Tiger King and that whole community. But I would have liked to see a bit more from people outside of this community, I think, to give a bit more of a perspective on how others perceive this community, as well as other people who are activists who aren't owning their own zoos and exhibiting animals themselves. So now that I told you guys my thoughts on Tiger King, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of the series down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.